Good morning, everybody. Hello and welcome to the Feminist Approaches to Localization panel as part of OCIC's Global Citizens Forum. Thank you so much for joining us. If you haven't already taken a look at the remaining sessions as part of the GCF, we encourage you to do so via the link that's just posted in the chat. Today's session will be conducted in English with simultaneous French interpretation. If you want to listen to this event in French, click on the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen and select the French channel. If you wish to listen to the event in English, you can join the English channel or just keep the interpretation off. My name is Anika Zalmi. I work at OCIC, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging today that I'm joining from the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe on Two-Row Wampum Belt and Dish with One Spoon territory. And the OCIC office is located on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. We are grateful to acknowledge that we live, work, and play on unceded Indigenous territories, but also I prompt us to think beyond land acknowledgement as just a way to name the Indigenous communities on whose land you live, work, and play, but rather the ways that framing your space, your location on unceded Indigenous territories can push you to think about the skills and lessons you can take away from today's session that will allow you to be a better ally to Indigenous communities in their own fight for self-determination. A land acknowledgement is meant to frame our existence as settlers on this land, and being a settler, like myself, comes with the responsibility and accountability to ensure we are working towards truth and reconciliation. Of course, if you yourself are Indigenous, the navigation of this topic may be different. A few housekeeping notes before we do begin. Please note that closed captioning is available and can be accessed by clicking on the live transcript and then the show subtitle button at the bottom of your screen. We hope that this service will help make this event more accessible. Throughout the event, feel free to ask questions using the Ask Question function at the bottom of your screen. This is different than the chat function. And finally, if you need support on any technical issues related to Zoom, please write in the chat box and a member of the OCIC team will support. Please also note that this session is being recorded. OCIC is committed to creating a safe and inclusive space, and so we ask all participants to commit to our code of conduct, inspired by those of the Intercouncil Network and Amnesty Canada. This was shared with you in advance of the session via email, and it also has been dropped in the chat by Marilyn if you need a refresher. The code of conduct for this event outlines our shared commitments towards respect, inclusion, humility, safety, solidarity, patience, and openness for all participants and collaborators. If you see or experience anything in conflict with this code of conduct, please do not engage directly. Contact an OCIC organizer and we will respond appropriately. Finally, I'd like to remind everyone to please use the hashtag IDW2022, hashtag #GoForTheGoals, and to tag OCIC on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook when posting about your experiences at the GCF. I'd like to now introduce our presenters for today's session. First up, we have Brittany Lambert, the Women's Rights Policy and Advocacy Specialist at Oxfam Canada. She leads Oxfam's policy and advocacy on humanitarian and refugee issues, bringing a strong gender lens to this work. She's been an advocate for the role of local women's rights actors in humanitarian action and authored the 2018 report, A Feminist Approach to Localization, among other incredible reports. Women's rights and human rights are at the heart of her vision for social change. Prior to working for Oxfam, she worked at the Canadian Council for International Cooperation, now known as Cooperation Canada, and the McGill Institute for Health and Social Policy. She has a master's degree from McGill University. Our second presenter is Farwah Qasim, a program officer for ending violence against women and girls at Oxfam Canada. She manages implementation of the Creating Spaces project in the Philippines, Nepal, and Pakistan. Farwah specializes in gender-based violence prevention and response and women's economic empowerment programming using community-driven development approaches. Farwah is a Muslim feminist who has advocated for women's rights from a young age. Prior to working for Oxfam, she worked at the World Bank Group and other international development organizations as a gender specialist and researcher. She is born and raised in Pakistan and has a master's degree from George Washington University in Washington, D.C. Without further ado, I will hand it over to the Oxfam team.
Hi, everyone. I'm Brittany. It's really nice to be here. I'm looking forward to speaking with you. And Marilyn, if you could start sharing the slides, that would be wonderful. So today we're going to be talking to you about a feminist approach to localization. And it's truly an honor to have been invited to speak on this topic. Some of you may know Oxfam Canada. We're part of an international confederation that does long-term development work, but also humanitarian work and also policy and campaigning work to try to address the structural issues that keep people in poverty. And we put women's rights at the center of everything that we do. You can switch the slides now, Marilyn. And we made the decision back in 2006, actually, to have a strategic focus on women's rights. But it's a continuous journey, and we're constantly learning and reflecting and adjusting our approaches. And one of the biggest moments of reckoning that we've had in relation to our feminist approach was our sector's Me Too movement. You may remember how it all started back in late 2017. The story that started it all actually was a story about Oxfam. It was a story about a small group of male Oxfam Great Britain staff that had, while they were working in the Haiti earthquake response in 2010, been involved in sexual exploitation and abuse. And so this, as you can imagine, hit us like a total thunderbolt. And it really forced us to grapple with the existential question of how an organization dedicated to women's rights and gender equality could find ourselves in this terrible position. And it really forced us to deepen our own introspection. And it became more clear than ever that ultimately it's power imbalances between North and South, between white and non-white, between men and women that led to these unacceptable events and that lead to them in our sector, unfortunately. And the solution also became more clear than ever, right? The solution to redouble our efforts to shift the power in all of these areas, which ultimately means shifting the power to the women and the women's organizations that are doing the work on the ground locally. And so, you know, an intersectional feminist approach to localization basically takes that power shift that localization is anyway, but it takes it as far as it can go. And you know, as a sector, we are making progress towards localization. There's widespread recognition that it's the most effective way to work, that it's the way that is most in line with our commitments to solidarity, equality, decolonization, and anti-racism. But we believe that as we shift power and resources to local and national actors, we have to do it in a feminist way. Otherwise, there's a risk that the process will just perpetuate or replicate or deepen the challenges that women and their organizations face and some of the gendered inequalities between civil society organizations in their national contexts. And so as part of our journey and introspection, Oxfam has developed feminist principles that shape and guide our approach to our work across the entire organization. So in our partnerships, but also in our long-term development work, our humanitarian programming, our policy and advocacy work, and our organizational culture and behavior. And so I've listed a few of them here on the right side of this slide. There wasn't room for all of them, but there are a few examples of our feminist principles. And as I go through them, I'd like you to think about how these are really part and parcel, one and the same in many ways as localization. So our first key feminist principle is supporting transformative change, right? Approaching our work with a feminist lens means that we're looking for sustainable, transformative change to redress historical power imbalances between men and women, between North and South. Another one is recognizing power and privilege. Our work recognizes that a lack of power and privilege are key determinants of poverty. And so we try to shine a light on systems that maintain the unequal division of power. Another key one is putting women's rights actors at the center of our work. So understanding that a strong and resilient feminist movement is a key driver to change on gender equality and on poverty around the world. Another key feminist principle is honoring context and complexity. So we all know, right, that a complex interplay of factors at the individual level, at the household level, at the community level, shape gender power relations. And it's different in each context. And we respect that our partners understand these contexts better than we do. And then, of course, the very important nothing about me without me, right? Partners hold the knowledge that they need on how to best transform their lives and should have autonomy, choice, and be empowered and have meaningful engagement. So when you break it down, and look at these, you could be talking about localization or feminist approach. We really believe that they're part and parcel, and they strive towards the same goals. They're fundamentally about shifting power, and they both fundamentally require us to rethink the way that we work in the international aid sector. And so this is all a bit theoretical, talking about principles, etc. But today, my colleague Farwah actually will make it really concrete with some examples about how we have tried to embody this approach through our flagship program, Creating Spaces, which strives to end and prevent violence against women and girls. And we grappled with whether to focus, how much to focus on humanitarian, how much to focus on development, because we often think of localization as a more humanitarian term. And certainly it's true that that's where the power divides are often most profound. But we've actually learned that when you're truly being guided by local actors, the silos between humanitarian and development work begin to disappear, right? People's contexts are fluid, and they are sometimes in crisis, and they are sometimes stable, and their work shifts to respond to whatever their context is. And their ambition is always to address their immediate needs, but without displacing the long-term aspirations for gender equality, for development, for peace. And so that's why in this presentation, we'll be using examples from both our long-term development and our humanitarian response, and showing how the two actually totally connect when they're being driven by local actors. And then finally, before passing it over to Farwah, I just wanted to say that, while we have spent a lot of time intentionally thinking about this stuff, and while we're honored to have been asked to speak about this topic, we are by no means the holders of the truth on feminist approaches or localization. And, we are constantly learning and adjusting, and we're reviewing the feminist principles we've developed, and we'll be revising them and nuancing them. So we look forward also to learning from you, and we would love if you have any thoughts or feedbacks or suggestion to hear from you in the chat or after the presentation. So thank you. Over to you, Farwah.
Hi, everyone. Next slide, please. So as Brittany said, thank you so much for kind of framing the discussion. And I'm going to be talking about the Creating Spaces project, which is our flagship project to end violence against women and girls. In Nepal, Pakistan, Philippines, Indonesia, Bangladesh, and India. So just to give you a brief of what the project was, and then I'll go into the feminist principles in action. So our project had 3 pillars. The first one focused on preventing violence against women and girls. The second was enhancing support for them, especially connecting them to economic opportunities. And the third one, which is, I want to speak a little bit more about it. It's something that we intentionally designed to make sure that we were localizing or building resources for our organizations and our partners to be able to access some funding for innovation, for us to build knowledge and learning activities that benefit the project and the people that we're serving, as opposed to just reporting to the donor, for example. And then also our capacity support. So that's why the pillar 3 was designed in a way that we could actually practice what what the theory of feminist principles is. Next slide, please. So feminist localization and action. So Brittany went through the feminist principles a little bit, and I would try to give some concrete examples of how we use these principles in our project. So First of all, I want to again, as Brittany said, preface this by saying we're not the best at doing localization, or but we try. We try to really intentionally build these principles in and recognize our power and privilege. Without going into too much detail about that, like, let me just tell you how we plan to do that, and how we did that in this project, which is almost at the end right now. The first thing, to support transformative change. So we understand that the power dynamics at play are very deeply entrenched in social norms and patriarchy. So our project really tried to tackle that at every level. So we follow the socio-ecological model, where we try to focus our interventions at the policy level, society level, community level, and at the individual level. So our aim was to try to challenge and change these social norms. And the first step towards that was having the right partners in place. So we prefer women's rights organizations in all of our countries, but sometimes the reality is that we cannot find that. So we try to have this criteria where we see if the organizations have done the work on women's rights, on gender-based violence prevention and response, and then have certain criteria to select them. And then I think that does 50% of the job, right? Having the right actors in place who know these issues, who have done great work to tackle these issues. And that's where we went in, and we really try to involve them in all stages of our project. And more so, we're trying to do that initially, like literally when we're even writing proposals, to make sure we incorporate their voice. So in Nepal, so the challenge in discriminatory social norms was something that was really successful. We established 180 community discussion centers across 4 districts, and they became spaces for women and children to come together, women and girls to come together and reflect on gender-based violence. Usually it's so normalized in our society that it's not even seen as a problem. So our partners, our local partners, use something called the reflect methodology to create a space where women and girls could reflect on these issues, but also develop solutions themselves. We sitting in Canada are not going to say that this is what you should be doing. They understand those issues, and they can say, okay, let's do this, this, and this. So through that process, we were able to use community theater to educate their communities about gender-based violence and how to reduce it at the household level. They were able to do door-to-door campaigns, involve the police to stop child marriage, to stop domestic violence cases. And another really unintended result that came out of this was that they knew there was a harmful practice called chopati, where women were forced to stay indoors in bad conditions during their menstruation. So they really started challenging these harmful practices, which was not in the original design of the project. So giving the power, giving the decision making to our local organizations leads to such amazing things happening on the ground. Another example I would like to give on the supporting transformative change is our legal change that happened in Indonesia and Philippines, where child marriage laws
Farwah?
sorry.
Sorry,
Yes.
this is Kim. The interpreters are just asking if you can go a little bit slower.
Oh, okay.
Okay, thank
Sure.
you.
Thank you. So I was talking about our collective action and strategies for legal reform in Indonesia and Philippines, where we, through our programming, through our advocacy, were able to change laws on child marriage. And this is no way something OCA did. It was the local partners that drove that change. So now in January 2022, actually, Philippines legalized banning of child marriage, and it's a very comprehensive law, and it was a result of youth advocacy. It started as a youth movement at the beginning of our project, where student leaders came together, and our partners really encouraged them, provided them with the tools to advocate on child marriage. They also connected them to senators, and for the first time in Philippines history, there was child marriage discussion on the table at the national level. And that's what happens when you give local partners, when you give youth the tools to advocate for themselves rather than you doing the advocating for them. Um, a second thing I would like to talk about is recognizing our power and privilege as an international organization. We are an international NGO, and realizing that us being the middle person between the donor and the people that we serve, it gives us a certain leverage of a certain power position. And we need to know that when we are doing small things in our ways of working, when we're talking to our country counterparts, for example, asking them and demanding them for deliverables or results, these small things that it really can affect our project if we don't recognize that power. We need to be a co-facilitators, co-learners with them. And we really try to do that in our Creating Spaces project. I'll give you an example. Um, so for example, in our project, we have the amazing results framework with everything under the sun to report on. Um, when in year 4, we were looking at our indicators and our results, and in Philippines, we said, okay, that's great that you're doing policy change, but you've actually met all those targets. Can you focus on X, Y, and Z activities that are still lagging a bit behind? But our local partners are very strong, and at this stage the law hadn't passed. They said, no, we really want to focus on this because we see this as a movement from the ground up, and we can see this happening in the future. So we that's where we want to focus our energy on. And we, as the international NGO, could have forced them to not focus on that or not fund that, because we do have that power, unfortunately. But be listening to them is so important, because even though we had to talk to the donor, we had to convince them that they are focusing on this, or this is the reason why the results are not being met. We actually saw this huge change, which is a policy change through continuous advocacy and engagement. So I think having our position, acknowledging our position of power and not letting that intervene with results on the ground is super important. Um, Another thing is the capacity assessment tool, which is also another tool that we use to really try to um, shift power and realize these feminist principles. This is not me or anyone at Oxfam Canada sitting and deciding in a room that this organization needs this capacity building. It's actually a assessment tool that's a self-reflection tool, which our organizations use to understand, and it's tailored for different areas of women's rights programming. So the one that we use was on ending violence against women and girls. There's another one on sexual reproductive rights, and so on and so forth. So this tool is used by organizations to reflect on where their capacities are and are not, and then they are the ones who determine priorities to build these capacities. And the session is facilitated as very equitable learning based, and then throughout the course of the project we try to see where the action plans implementation was. And this was also not a perfect process, as we'll talk about later. Another thing is honor complex and complexity that Brittany talked about. It is so important to do that, especially in a multi-country project where we know that these countries are so complex that from one area, from one city to another city, there would be a whole complete cultural shift. So what we tried to do was, number one, build in that innovation fund that other organizations could tap into if they wanted to do something different. If they wanted to, they use that for South-South exchange, for example. They use that to test innovative things such as a interactive voice a response system where they tested to improve services for gender-based violence. Another thing is that letting the project take its course, right? So in different countries, even though we had a coherent project design overall, but it took different directions. So in Nepal, the CDCs became the main driving force. In Pakistan, there were women groups that were happening more at the sidelines and not at the forefront because of the dangers that there are associated with this work. In India, there was women's support centers that were funded and that really led to some of our great work. So allowing that to happen and allowing the local organizations to really lead that change is where the localization happens. And the focus on learning was very thought out in the project. We had a learning event every year where we brought together all of these countries to kind of exchange notes, exchange what was working, what was not working, how to, and also plan for the next year grounded in that learning. And this is once a year for all the countries, but the countries themselves had such sessions almost, I think, 3 to 4 times a year where they would come in, reflect, plan, readjust. So those building those learning in and events in really helped us. Another thing about balancing learning and accountability. So when we talk about learning for whom, right? Are we preparing fancy reports for donors, or are we actually trying to contribute to the field of prevention and response and trying to use this to strengthen our local partners? So this is where we really try to build in small studies throughout the project so that there was continuous learning going on alongside donor reporting and such documents. And we are very intentional about using feminist research methods where it's not a evaluator going in from an international space to a local space and telling this is what you were supposed to do, you didn't do, but actually that person being a co-listener. And our organizations, our local partners actually made decisions about the learning agenda, the learning questions, what we would study, and that's what came into our reports and our studies, and you can access that on our impact page. So really democratizing that learning and making sure that our reports built on that. And that knowledge, some of the evidence, the reports that we had that was used for advocacy, that would use for making these booklets, which was used to educate the community on these issues and access services. Some of it was used um, to advocate for legal change. So I think those are some of the examples where we really try to localize our work and give the women's right organizations and our local partners the decision making and transference of the power. So that's it from my side on this. And now Brittany is going to talk about some of the lessons learned, and I will also chime in.
Thanks so much, Farwah. So yeah, through our experiences and also through a lot of research that we've done over the past few years, we've done interviews with many women's rights actors that are working in fragile contexts to try to, understand what they work on, how they work, the barriers they face in their work. And so we've been grappling with some issues, which I will share with you now. So Marilyn, you can switch to the next slide. So the first is around selecting partners, right? So if we agree that our aspiration, in a feminist approach to localization is to work with and shift power to local women's rights organizations that are ideally women-led and have a rights-based, transformative, intersectional approach, in reality, this can pose some challenges, right? So sometimes the organizations in a certain context can't identify themselves as women's organizations, as feminist organizations for different reasons, either for cultural reasons, for security reasons, in a context of closing civil society space. Sometimes we have a different issue where, our existing partners don't quite correspond to this definition, but want to undertake a journey of becoming a more feminist organization. And in that case, we try to meet them where they're at and strengthen their capacity to become more gender just organizations. So we have a capacity assessment tool that Farwah referred to earlier to try to guide organizations through a self-assessment of how they can deepen their gender justice work and what changes they can make to their internal structures to make sure that they are gender just across the organization, because we know all the links that there are between the walk and the talk, right? Doing meaningful gender justice works requires you to also have feminist ways of working within your organization. And then in some contexts, especially in humanitarian contexts, for example, in a remote border area where a refugee camp has spontaneously popped up, women's rights organizations, local women's rights organizations simply might not exist in that place. And so in those cases, we're trying to challenge ourselves to take a more gradual approach to partnership that begins by helping to build individual women leaders and providing them with opportunities to connect with other women leaders in the camp. And by supporting their leadership and movement building, we find that these women often do join together organically to address the problems that they face in their communities. So all to say that, when identifying the best partners, there's a need for a nuanced and highly context-specific approach, and also an understanding that it's a process rather than something that you can check off and say, okay, all our partners right now meet this exact definition. Farwah, I don't know if you had anything to add on that topic.
I just wanted to speak to a little bit on the shrinking civic space. That's a huge challenge that we have seen in our project, especially with regards to working with women's rights organizations. So during our project, for example, in Pakistan, we had a great partner, the Aurat Foundation, and they were doing such amazing work, but the government decided to introduce this really complicated process of verification and registration because of the concerns related to foreign funding of local organizations. And that created a lot of issues for us because this partner we had been working for so long was suddenly not allowed to work with us. So things like this. In India recently, now we have seen that Oxfam is not allowed to receive any foreign funding anymore. And then these registration processes, they were a continuous barrier, even in countries like Nepal and countries like Bangladesh. So I think we need to, again, our positional powers, see how we can advocate with our countries on how to create more space for women's rights organizations, because it is shrinking. We are facing a lot of censorship, a lot of issues, and already there is such limited funding to these organizations. With this shrinking civic space, it's becoming more and more difficult. So I think that's one of the challenge that we continue to face.
Great. So a second challenge that we bump up against, and this is a huge one, and I'm sure it's on all of your radars as well, is the need for advocacy. Our best intentions are limited by donor funding structures, requirements, etc. So one of the issues that we find is particularly salient for funding women's rights organizations is the fact that our funding in Canada and in other donors as well is still very siloed, right? You can get funding through humanitarian development, peace building, but our interviews with women's rights organizations working in fragile contexts shows that their work actually often bridges these areas. They have a very holistic approach to the problems that their communities are facing and how to address them. And so the same organization might be helping survivors of conflict-related sexual violence in the Democratic Republic of Congo, for example, but also supporting women to stand in elections to make their society less patriarchal, to make it less likely that this type of violence will occur in the future, right? So they see all of these interventions as part of the same, reaching the same goals, but their work doesn't necessarily neatly fit into donor silos. And so sometimes it's difficult actually for them to get funding for their holistic approaches, even though that is actually ideally what we want and need to see if we're trying to reach transformative objectives like deepening gender equality, even in crisis settings, right? And so I think if we want to see this type of work, we need to push donors to have less rigid funding silos and better support work that bridges the nexus, the humanitarian development peace nexus. And I know this is a priority for global affairs right now, and that's wonderful, is to see them, grappling with how to better support this holistic, integrated work. We also, I think, really need to see changes on direction and control, right? We have a feminist international assistance policy that explicitly strives to find innovative ways of working with local women's rights organizations. But this policy is out of step with our tax act. And so in reality, it's hard to support local organizations unless we micromanage them much more than we would like to, right? And this, you can call it colonialist, patronizing, infantilizing. It's the opposite of what localization or a feminist approach seeks to achieve. So I think so that's why we have advocacy as a key part of our work. It's kind of a precursor to unblocking and allowing us to be able to really work the way that we would like to. Farwah, I don't know if you had anything to add in that regard.
Yes, I think just on building on what Brittany said about, the humanitarian development, this siloed approach, what we see happening is a lot of overlap, right? So you'll have a long-term development project, but we'll see humanitarian issues emerge. For example, in Philippines, we had conflict going on in a Mindanao region. We had landslides, we had floods, and then year 5, COVID hit. So everything, it became very complex. In addition to the project, which was very complex itself. So, and then we kind of expected our organizations, our partners, to completely shift from implementing on the ground, building those relationships, to online modes of delivery, without giving them any additional resources, without giving them tools such as, like IT tools or training on them. So it was quite unfair to expect that, and there was very limited flexibility on our end, on our donors end, to kind of support them with that. And it's not like pointing fingers at anyone, because it was such a difficult and weird time for all of us to figure out. But I think moving forward, there is one thing I would definitely say from this 6 years that we have learned is this flexible funding mechanisms, and also being less rigid with our results focus approach, right? What are results? Like, I think we need to be less focused on those numbers, on those very rigid indicators, and be more aware of the qualitative results that we are seeing, for example. So and another thing is this whole being dependent on what gets decided at the top level, right? Like sometimes, we had the standalone project that led to really amazing results, but now it's more of a mainstreaming approach on women's rights issues, gender-based violence issues, without much consultations with people who are doing this work on the ground. And it's so disappointing to see when our project is ending, and we did come up with models that work, and instead of scaling up that work, we have to move out. And there are some really great examples where the local government took, for example, in one of the districts, they took the budget for the CDCs, and then there is some sustainability, but obviously we have to move out. And then decides that it's a issue to be mainstream or to be funded alone? So I think having local actors play some of that decision-making role is super important.
Yeah, and some of what you were saying, Farwah, segues nicely into the next point, which is the importance of core funding and organizational capacity strengthening. So in all our projects and research and interviews, the lack of quality funding available to women's rights organizations is consistently raised. So quality funding ideally would mean long-term, predictable funding that allows actors to define their approaches and priorities. And it would be funding that covers core costs, right? Overheads to pay rent, equipment, things that aren't sexy and don't look great in a results report, but that are absolutely key to building and maintaining capacity to develop institutionally. Often the lack of this quality funding makes organizations unable to afford long-term or offer long-term job security to their staff because they grow for a project and then scale back when the funding ends. And so they lose people who have been trained, and it kind of keeps them in this cycle where they are dependent on international project funding as opposed to be able to have the systems to seek that funding directly on their own. And so this is obviously a problem for all local organizations, but most especially for women's rights organizations, because they are the most underfunded of all civil society organizations globally. It's a real problem in this sector in particular. Did you have anything to add?
Just one thing. I think as international NGOs, what we really need to be focusing on is for us to basically work towards not having a job, because the future should be local organizations working with having enough a representation and enough ability and connections to be able to access this funding, or to be able to have their own fundraising mechanisms to do this important work, and we shouldn't be the middle person anymore. And I think that's what we try to do, especially like, for example, in Nepal, now that we have a strong country office, we're trying to link them with the donors that we have access to so that they take on the work, and we have as little to do as possible.
And then a final point I just wanted to make is, there's still a lack of clarity when we're talking about local, about just how local we're talking about, right? Do we mean national? That is obviously a step closer to the ground and is better than international, but it still doesn't have the same advantages of being truly local, right? And so I'm thinking, for example, of a refugee camp setting. We work in a refugee camp in Gambela, which is in Ethiopia, and it's mostly South Sudanese refugees in this camp. And so we work with local organizations. Most of the local organizations there are Ethiopian, so from the host country, and mostly from the capital city. And so we're trying to challenge ourselves to really go deeper in our partnerships because there are such advantages to doing so. So for example, working with Gambela-based CSOs who better understand the local communities that these refugees have been flowing into. Often in refugee settings, the local community has a lot of resentment towards refugees arriving because they were financially stressed to begin with, and this takes a toll on their resources, and they feel that the NGOs that come in or the local organizations from the capital that come in are all focused on addressing poverty in the refugee camps as opposed to the surrounding community. And so this resentment and tension we have seen can be taken out in the form of gender-based violence against the refugee women. And so working with a Gambela-based CSO who has this double lens, who understands the local community's grievances because they're part of that local community, but who also understands the refugees because they're working towards gender equality and helping refugees, that unique vantage point can really help in this regard and can keep women safer ultimately. And And we're also challenging ourselves to go even further and support the formalization of refugee-led or religious-based organizations in the camps, so that actual members of the refugee community can be registered partners on equal footing, instead of just seeing their work as activities in the projects that we're running. Right. And so again, it's a process. It's not without its challenges, but these are some of the things that we're thinking about as we try to deepen our work in this regard. Anything to add, Farwah?
No, thank you. Brittany.
Great. Well, you can change to the next slide, Marilyn. So that is it. Thank you for being here. This is our contact info. We'd love to hear from you and know what you think, if you have any suggestions or learnings of your own to share with us as we continue to reflect on all of this. We have a Jamboard prepared. Annika, I don't know, we're also getting close to time. What is your thought on whether we should go ahead and do this or just end early and give everybody a bit of a break?
It's up to you if you'd like. We can end up early, but if you can do it in a couple of minutes, sure, we can do a quick sharing some comments.
I think it's more of a participatory exercise. It will take more time. So I think, and since we have very limited time, we should kind of open ourselves to questions instead of the Jamboard, because that takes more time. Usually we need at least 15 minutes for it. What do you think, Brittany?
Sure. So if there are any questions, you can pop those in the chat, and we're happy to respond in the last few minutes that we have.
I just saw a question on the capacity assessment tool by Barry. He or she is saying that they're doing something similar. I'm going to share in writing form the links to our different capacity assessment tools for different fields and the guidance note that goes with it as well. So I'm just doing that right now. If there are any other questions, let us know. I think one thing I would like to ask you all is if you have done any work on localization or have any ideas that you would like to share with us, because this is obviously a continuous learning process and we are trying to do more of this. But if you have done anything along those lines or plan to do anything, please let us know as well.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I see a couple of questions that have been shared. And once again, a reminder to participants, if you have any questions for our incredible panelists, please drop it into the Q&A function, not the chat. You can find that at the bottom of your screen. And I see that Farwah is responding to a couple of the questions now. But maybe what we can do is, as folks write some questions or share some reflections, we can close off today and give everyone a couple of minutes to transition to our next session. So I want to just share once again a huge thank you to Brittany and Farwah for your insight and expertise. It's been such an honor and pleasure to learn from you. I really admire the work of Oxfam. I know you folks are one of the biggest leaders in international development and women's rights work. And I see messages and comments about how encouraging this work is and how reassuring it is to know that not just there are folks who are leaders on this, but also team members and colleagues and working towards that spirit of collaboration and not competition. So thank you so much for sharing your insight there. I'll invite everyone in attendance now to please complete a short Zoom poll that should be launching now on your screens. I'll give you folks a couple of minutes to respond to that. It's very quick. This is not, this will not be shared publicly. This is just for OCIC's monitoring and evaluation purposes. So we're just tracking who's here and how transformative this session has been. While you complete that, I would like to also draw your attention to the other events happening today as part of our Global Citizens Forum. Starting right at 11 a.m. in 10 minutes, the Primates World Relief and Development Fund is hosting a panel discussion with their partners throughout Africa on maintaining many of the gains they have made during COVID-19. And finally, at 2 p.m. EST today, we are hosting a discussion in partnership with Rage and Share Care on women's grassroots leadership in Haiti. That session will be also offered in Haitian Creole live translation. Once again, as a huge thank you to Brittany and Farwah for sharing their wisdom with us in this panel. This is not the last time that we will hope to be collaborating with Oxfam. So for both Brittany and Farwah, as well as the participants in attendance, we hope that you'll continue to be involved and keep an eye out on OCIC social media for any future collaborations with Oxfam Canada. I'd also like to thank Marilyn, Eliana, and Lisa from the OCIC team for their tech support today, as well as our interpreters and interpretation support, Ruben, Andre, Zoe, and Roni from MCIS Language Solutions. With that, I will once again remind folks that you will find the description and registration for the session happening at 11 a.m. in the chat. And I look forward to seeing you folks at the rest of our events today. Thank you so much for being here.